So
All right.
Memphis,
It is just about time for us to begin this evening. Welcome to everyone who has come here, both in person and via the live stream. I'm Heidi Rupke, and just a couple of housekeeping notes as we get started. First of all, many of you have been here for the other weeks that we have done this, but for the newcomers, what is a live podcast recording? What we're doing right now is we are live streaming this conversation onto the internet, and then we will take the audio later and make it into a podcast, but you are part of that. So if your cell phone goes off, you have made the podcast. So please turn them off. If it's funny, please feel free to laugh. This is not like the please don't let a pin drop kind of place. If it's funny, it'd be great if you laugh. Applaud if you are so moved, and think of a great question to ask. We may have some time at the end for a little bit of interaction with the audience. So this is a public conversation, and I've prepared some questions, but honestly, we don't know exactly how this is going to go down. So thanks for being part of the creative process. All right. Welcome to Dialogue, the Lenten Preaching Series Podcast. I'm Heidi Rupke, the Lenten Preaching Series Coordinator, and I'm here with guests Ms. Kaitlin Curtice and Dr. Jemar Tisby to explore the topic of the future of faith. As we shepherd our 100-year-old preaching series, we're grateful for the work of those who've come before us, and we're also here to consider the legacy that we might be leaving for the next century of questioners and faithful people. Tonight, we're here with Dr. Jemar Tisby, a historian, speaker, and author whose first book, The Color of Compromise, carefully documented the ways that the Christian church has explicitly sanctioned racist practices throughout the centuries. In his writing, he proposes that sometimes the most effective way to generate change in an institution is to take a step back from the tight and established circles of power. He started The Witness, a Black Christian collective, as one way to gather and share out ways of being authentic selves in a Christian context. His second book, How to Fight Racism, takes a practical approach to structural systems that we could reimagine and recreate. When he's not writing, you can catch his podcast, Pass the Mic, which he co-hosts with Tyler Burns. Ms. Kaitlin Curtice is an award-winning poet, writer, and storyteller who's explored the intersections of the mundane and the sublime, ancestral imprints and present-day implications, systemic power, and individual action. The author of 3 books, including her most recent, Living Resistance, Kaitlin speaks widely to a variety of audiences who identify with a variety of faith categories. She is an enrolled member of the Potawatomi Nation and was raised in the evangelical Christian faith. Kaitlin brings home the complexities of categories with genuine warmth and compelling critique. Welcome, Jemar and Kaitlin.
Thank you.
All right, so I am a big fan of Krista Tippett, and I love the question that she always starts her podcast on being with. Tell us a little bit about the spiritual background of your childhoods.
I'll go first. So I always kind of describe my childhood in 2 parts. So I'll tell you the 2 parts of my childhood. At age 9, my parents divorced, and my dad left our family. So that was a traumatic time, but also in my identity and in how I viewed the world. It was a really important time for me. So before age 9, I grew up in, Oklahoma, New Mexico. A lot in my heart, in my mind, had a very sort of mystical relationship to the land, but also grew up Southern Baptist. So even when I was young, that was just rooted in us, was that also that conversation in my mind of, am I good enough? And do I need salvation? And all the things that a good Southern Baptist child would ask in Oklahoma and New Mexico. So, but also my father was a BIA officer. He worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and so having the weird complexity of, my dad didn't really go to church with us, but we went to church, and we're Potawatomi, but we don't talk about it because colonization has stripped us of those conversations in a lot of ways. So very strange sort of mix of things. And then at age 9, my dad left, and my parents got divorced, and so he moved to Oklahoma, and we were living in Missouri at that time. And so kind of small town Missouri, a church on every street corner, very immersed in Southern Baptist culture even more. And then my mother got remarried to my stepfather, who's wonderful, and he was a Southern Baptist pastor. And so the church, specifically the Southern Baptist Church, became my safe place. It became the place where I had to reconcile my identity, where I had to assimilate into that culture, and I had to be a pastor's kid, right? So I had to become the face of that, and became the good, people-pleasing little girl, and lost a lot of my Potawatomi identity in that process, and didn't fully know how to reconcile that inside of myself. And so, was in the purity movement, wanted to be a famous worship leader, just had it all going, and it got way more complex once I entered college. But my childhood was in these two parts, and a lot of moving pieces and a lot of complexity that I think I probably share with a lot of other people who have some of these kind of complexities in their backgrounds in their childhood.
I grew up north of Chicago, and my family wasn't religious, but wasn't anti-religious. It just wasn't a big topic, although I think out of a sense of obligation, my mom insisted that we get baptized, and it was actually in a Southern Baptist church, which was interesting. It was literally across the street. And I think the proximity is also how I ended up in Catholic schools for most of my education. K through 8, went to a Catholic school because our neighbor down the street was the principal. And so I never got away with anything. I never even tried anything. And then in high school, this classic evangelical conversion story, friendship evangelism. There's a guy in my high school health and PE class. It was at this ungodly hour in the morning. Why do we make kids get up so early for school? But he was this dorky dude who I noticed just didn't cuss, didn't use swear words, which was really, really weird in high school. And he just befriended me and eventually invited me to his youth group, which the whole thing is set up to draw you in. They had food, they had games, they had girls, and it was like, hey, this is a great thing to do on a Wednesday night. Oh no, they're talking about Jesus. Sure, I'll sit down for 15 minutes until we can get to the pizza. But somehow, the messages started making sense, and then they sort of, in a cordial way, kind of cornered me in at a retreat. It was like a winter retreat. We were in a cabin. It was an all-boys cabin, and I remember the smell of wet socks. And that's where I prayed the sinner's prayer and accepted Jesus into my heart. Of course, I had no idea really what that meant, but it was real. There was something genuine about it. So I quickly became a leader in that evangelical youth group. It was part of, this is like the 90s, so this is part of like the seeker-sensitive movement and church growth and all of that stuff, and started going to the churches associated. So it was all these, messages, 3 steps to a healthy marriage, 5 steps to, manage your finances. Like that was from the pulpit. What was never spoken of was anything about race. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of a recent realization. Like I didn't have a negative experience in this time. It wasn't like people were being malicious or overtly racist or anything. It just wasn't a topic. It was invisible to them, and therefore part of me was invisible to them. And it was this assimilation thing. Like, oh yeah, you're one of us. Just leave all that culture and race stuff out the door, but you're one of us. And all of that is in the background. I get to college, another Catholic school, Notre Dame, and an interesting religious streams start to intersect at that point. I get exposed to something called Reformed theology, and then the first Reformed church I go to is a Dutch Reformed church. And I had always been one of just a couple of people of color in these evangelical spaces. At this Dutch Reformed church, I was the only person of color there. And I had no idea, but Dutch folks run tall, and I'm not, so I just stuck out. And at the same time, they had something called the Center for Social Concerns at Notre Dame, which was based on Catholic social teaching. And it was through that I got involved in service projects. I spent a summer in the inner city of Chicago doing a day camp for youth. And that is what sort of planted the seed for me after graduation joining Teach for America. And that's how I got down to the Delta region of Arkansas, which I was in Phillips County, which was the 4th poorest county in the entire country. And I taught 6th grade, and I was a middle school principal. But all of that, you know, those different religious streams kind of coming together, and I'm still trying to figure it out.
I think you guys are both poster childs for multiple identities, Venn diagrams of multiple categories. I mentioned earlier this is the 100th year of this preaching series, and so I wanted to play with that idea of time a little bit. And I wanted you to think back to an ancestor of yours who would have been alive at the time that this preaching series at Calvary started in 1923. And if you could, tell us who that person was and maybe what they would have thought about faith at that time. I know it's projection, but who are your people, your ancestors?
So with this question, I thought about Hannah Brandt, who is my Potawatomi ancestor. And she was alive during this time. And to set the scene for this, in 1838, there was a forced removal of Potawatomi people from Indiana into Kansas. So, you know, you've heard of the Trail of Tears. I'm sure this was a forced removal of our people called the Trail of Death. And it was, you know, designed by the U.S. government, so they were forced at gunpoint to leave. So there's still a lot of Potawatomi in the Great Lakes region, but this particular group was forced to walk for 2 months to Kansas, to a home they had never been before, and completely relocate. So my ancestor, Hannah Brandt, her family was one of those people. And so she was born in Kansas, and then my other ancestors ended up going into Oklahoma, which is where I was born and where my tribe is today. And I think that illustrates a lot, says a lot about the complexity she probably held, like I do. Having connection to the ancestors in my family who especially are women, and especially are Potawatomi women, I cannot imagine what they were trying to deal with and understand if by the time I was born, if talking about being Potawatomi was silenced completely in our family due to trauma from colonization, then I can only imagine how that seed was planted in them even before Hannah Brandt, I'm sure. And so I think about her a lot, and I write in my new book about that the work we do today, it is possible to heal our ancestors, even in the work that we're doing now, as a way to understand our existence as a collective existence, that we need to pay attention to that so that we can be a part of healing past generations and future generations along with this lifetime we're living now. And so thinking about that forced removal, how my people even ended up in Oklahoma, and what that means for me to trace the steps back again. I think about her a lot and her family and our family and how we got here and how we can get back again, back home in a way.
So one of the challenges for African-descended people in the U.S. is being cut off from our ancestors and our history. I've been to different parts of Africa, but this past November had an opportunity for the first time to go to West Africa and went to Benin, which was colonized by the French. It's also the location of the historic Dahomey Kingdom. So if you've seen or heard of the movie Warrior King, the warriors were actual historical people in this region, in Benin. And I remember we didn't get to the coast for until a couple of days after we arrived. And then we went to the coast, and I'd never been on that side of the Atlantic. And with each step as we got closer to the ocean, there were actual physical waves, but there were waves of emotion that started to cascade over me as I realized my people at some point, somewhere, were on this western coast of Africa. And they have this big arch there called the Door of No Return. It's built recently, but it symbolizes the passing from your ancestral homeland across the ocean into this life of race-based chattel slavery. So all of that as lead up to, an ancestor who was alive in 1923. We know very little of our history before or even during our grandparents' time, but my dad's dad, my grandfather, was born in 1907, and he lived to 103 years old.
Wow.
So he was alive then, and I don't remember him as especially religious or anything, but he was in Louisiana, and the family lore is he was in moonshining, and this was common,
Wow.
It was like during the Great Depression, and people are trying to make ends meet. It was just a side hustle, basically. But he was getting too rich. He was getting too much money from it. And he was coming home from his day job, whatever that was, and one of his neighbors stops him before he gets home. He's like, "Don't go home. They're waiting for you." He's like, "Who's waiting for us?" And it was the white moonshiners who were upset that he was horning in on their business. And so without ever going home, he went straight to California and started a new life, brought his family over there, and that's part of what he would have been dealing with. But whether they were religious or not, the black church is really the oldest, and at that point, pretty much the only semi-autonomous black institution where you would go for anything that you needed, from food to money to affirmation or whatever. So, yeah, a little bit of family history.
Well, I'm actually going to jump in on this question myself, just for a little bit of contrast, because I like thinking about our grandparents, imagining the three of us in a room together, and wonder if they could. My grandparents were also alive in 1923. My maternal grandmother was Hulda Koch. So those of you who are listening carefully, that's a Dutch name. So Jemar, I don't know if our paths have crossed in some sort of way before we got here. She would have been a child living on a farm in a very rural area. For my grandparents' faith, they would have been at a Dutch Reformed church. It was the cultural and social glue of that little town, and those people living on the prairie where farming is not easy, and you are always at the mercy of the weather, a blizzard. Like literally, this is where Laura Ingalls Wilder had those locusts come down, and there's electric storms and it floods, and so they're very, very close to the land. But and I think too about the people of that town in living memory. The elders of that time would have told my grandparents probably about Indian removal, native removal from that land. The Lakota and the Dakota people have a lot of, have reservation land there now. So to me, thinking about, these three stories that we have, the faith journeys that we bring here, I think it gives me hope that such distinct beginnings can come to a conversation, and it makes me excited for what maybe our kids will be able to experience. And we'll go to the next generations in coming questions. But I want to poke more into the faith question and what is it exactly? We've got a lot of names, we've got institutions, but I want to ask you how we measure it. In modern times, we like to count things. We like to count attendance. We like to count members. We like to count souls saved if you're in a certain vein. Or if you're on social media, how many subscribers, downloads, views do we have? What do you think would be an alternative measure for faith? How could we show that faith is effective without just counting things?
You want to go first?
When the pandemic happened, I remember being frustrated because I was in this tiny little church in the Delta, and as difficult as it was for any sort of faith community to figure out what it means to be a faith community when you couldn't physically meet together, there were some congregations and communities that were able to pivot pretty quickly and honestly easily, relatively speaking. They had AV teams, they had video cameras, they had, anything that you would need to essentially go digital. We didn't. We had archaic equipment. We still had cassette players in the church. Wow. We didn't use them, but they were there.
There's one here in this building, I know.
There's one.
I've seen it.
And I remember being so frustrated. It's like, but we can't do this. We can't have this like big production and multiple camera angles and everything on Zoom or whatever it is. And it forced me to think, well, if not every church can do it, is it essential to being the church? And I decided it wasn't. And so when you talk about measuring things, they'll know we're Christians by our love, right? And so how we care for people, especially in the hardest times, like a pandemic, I think is tough to measure. But I think one sort of biblical model I keep coming back to is fruitfulness. You'll know a tree by its fruit. And if we have people in our faith communities that are bearing the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, all of those things, if we are in our communities, our witness is a pleasant one, a positive one, to me, those are the things that indicate, is the church being what Christ said it should be? Because there's going to be plenty, more and more and more churches that don't have a lot of funding or even a lot of people or all of these measures that we look at. But that can't be, God's calculus is just so different.
This is a tough question because I can think of more and more things that faith isn't. Like,
That's
valid. I see so many communities wanting to, put a Band-Aid on things that we don't want to talk about and call it healing, or wanting to check the to-do list for the DEI instead of treating it as this lifelong thing that we have to work toward, or
I'm going to explain DEI.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of these things that have become popularized, we want to treat them as a box to be checked. Like, you brought an Indigenous person, you brought a Black person to speak, and check the box, and that's not what faith is, and it can't be that. And obviously, I just wrote a book on wellness and wholeness, and what could it possibly mean to be whole, and will we even find wholeness in our lifetime? But what I come back to a lot is that our faith is not linear, and it can't be treated in a linear way, like our healing, like our wholeness. And we've been so wired to think of things in this point A to point B way that can we start thinking of the love and the care and the work that we do in the world as cycles that follow the seasons, cycles that follow the seasons of our own lives, cycles that follow the care for other people, the solidarity, the embodiments that we're supposed to be creating for and with each other. Can we like, a lot of faith might just be being willing to unlearn some of these ways that we have been taught to think about ourselves and each other and the earth. And can we unlearn some of those ways and pick up other ways of learning and bring that into ourselves? Can we do that personally, and can we do it on a communal level? And I've seen people do it, and I think we can, but it takes time. It takes a lot of time.
It's bringing up just so many thoughts for me about how, I mean, the church is sort of given a lot of different metaphors, but so often organic ones. And it reminds me of, like, you know, if you take a potato from the ground or an apple from the tree, it ain't clean and shiny. It's dirty, it's imperfect, right? But it can still be healthy. And I get really concerned as you talk about measuring how polished the church has become in a lot of ways. You can think of that internally and just like the liturgy itself, but I'm also thinking especially online. You know, folks were already doing, you know, church services and things and airing them online, but that it really ramped up during the pandemic. And I'm just like, this is like Hollywood studio quality stuff here.
Thank you to our videographer, Noah. Thank you.
Great job, Noah. And I love it. Like, I want my stuff to be that high quality too. But I'm also like, there's gonna be a draw to produce faith, make it a production. Which then lends itself to these sort of very corporate, businessy kind of measures. And I'm convinced some of these pastors should have just started their own company and not gone into the clergy. Because that's your calling. Like, that's clearly your gifting. You don't have to make yourself feel holy by being a pastor, but you're really like a business management expert. Right. Like, just go be a business manager and love Jesus, right? So anyway, yeah.
I love the ways that you're revising the way that we think about things. The word organic, the words healing your ancestors. We're playing with time here, and we're playing with, I mean, across even lines of death, right? If we're talking about people who are no longer living, how does that faith continue and get reflected back to them? But I want to follow up on your word organic. What do you think is our responsibility to live as faithful people with the land? I'll just tip my hand and say, I love the environmental movement. I love to be outside. It's wonderful. But I can definitely get into the mindset that weather and nature is kind of a backdrop. I can like it or I can not like it, but I'm not sure about my relationship with it. And how is the land an actor other than something that makes me wear a coat or rain boots?
Well, we call Mother Earth Sugamakwe in Potawatomi. And of course, again, I write about all this in my book, but a lot, actually. It's quite repetitive. I'm like, you have a relationship with the earth. Did I tell you in the last chapter? You have a relationship with Mother Earth. Did you know you have a relationship with Mother Earth? I really like it. It's repetitive on purpose because, again, we need repetition. It's cyclical. It's in cycles. And one thing that I started doing actually during COVID when I would lead workshops on Zoom is I have people start a love letter to Mother Earth, to Sugamakwe. And I do this because I think that so much even of our climate movements is so people-focused, which it should be. Like, obviously, I love people. But there's something about our relationship to our mother, to Mother Earth, that can sometimes be ignored, that the earth isn't it, and we obviously need to preserve ourselves, and whatever happens, happens, but we're doing this for us. And sometimes I just want to remind people to step back and recognize that whatever lands we have or haven't been on, and oppression and colonization coming into the mix of this, that whoever we are, anywhere on the earth, we have some sort of relationship to Mother Earth. And so I encourage people to write a love letter to Mother Earth too. I tell them it's a define the relationship letter. You really start from the beginning. I loved you as a kid. I don't know what happened. I don't really know who you are. I don't really know who I am always. I wonder if we can fix this. Can it be, like, just be honest. And I've encouraged people to start a journal, like have a journal and write letters to her as a being, as someone that you can repair a relationship with. I think it would drastically change the way that we view climate conversations and environmental conversations and Christianity, because we don't talk about this. I grew up in a world of dominion, right? It was dominion. It was, as humans, we are at the top, and everything else can just be what it needs to be, and we get to rule, you know? And to have this humble, beautiful relationship of reciprocity and care, we really need it. I actually think it's a part of our healing as individuals. It's a part of our collective healing. We really need it. We need to at least examine and hopefully begin to repair that relationship.
Oh, this land conversation is so multi-layered, and I'm thinking of it through a racial lens and an African-American one. So you can go all the way back to the so-called doctrine of discovery in the 1450s, which was essentially the Pope giving divine sanction for conquering land and converting the pagans, right? And so much of the colonialism that Kaitlin referenced, so much of the history of African people in the United States is connected to acquiring land and extracting resources to enrich some other place. And then living in the Delta has been really formative for me. It's a place that is deeply shaped by nature. So I don't know if you've ever seen the Mississippi River, but once you see it, everything else is a trickle. You're like, this beautiful, dangerous, unpredictable body of water has shaped it's called a delta. It's really an alluvial plain, a floodplain. And that's because of the river, when it overflows and then leaves all this rich sediment, and it becomes cotton country, where enslaved people picked cotton, where sharecroppers picked cotton. And so there's this exploitative relationship where our labor was exploited in service to wealthy people who owned the land, right? And at the same time, there's this deep connection. There's this really cool place in Helena. It's a distillery, and they make gin and bourbon, and it's owned by a black family. And what's unique about it is most of these kind of spirits, alcoholic spirits, are usually derived strictly from corn. They use a combination of corn and sweet potatoes grown on their own farm, which this black family has owned for generations. And so it's a kind of a neat, story of redemption in that sense. And I'm going back to where I lived before. I live now in Louisville, Kentucky, but we had been living in the Delta for years and years. I'm going back for the first time in months. And the thing I'm most looking forward to is walking this trail, this nature trail that literally got me through the pandemic in terms of so now I think a lot about land in terms of mental and spiritual health.
Yeah.
It's those walks outside in nature, rain, snow, sun, cold, heat, whatever it is, but just being surrounded by sort of God's unadulterated creation, hadn't been fiddled with too much by human hands, has just been incredibly healing for me.
Last year, we had a preacher here, Dr. Ellen Davis, who's a Hebrew Scriptures scholar, and she talked with us about how Hebrew people perceived the land as reflecting God's favor to them. Like when the land is producing well, God is pleased with us, and when it's not, we've got to repent. We're doing something wrong. How could that sort of framework help us as people of faith, again, in the climate crisis, as people, who are looking at, smaller and smaller spaces that are quote unquote unadulterated? How could that mindset set us up? Or is that a helpful model?
I have to think a bit on that.
I mean, the first thing I think about is what you mentioned, the relationship to the land. Just as we don't exist in isolation from other human beings, we don't exist in isolation from nature and our surroundings. And absolutely, in Louisville, there are these studies, and this is in communities around the country, that demonstrate lower income communities, which are disproportionately Black and brown communities, experiencing massively higher levels of health issues because of pollution. Right. And they're zoned and they're sort of shuffled into these areas of the cities that have all of this pollution because they can't afford to live elsewhere. And that just sort of demonstrates that relationship between the health of the land and our surroundings and our own health, even just physically. But then, as you're saying, these shrinking portions of unadulterated nature, those are not areas that have like huge parks around, right? Like, so that our kids are growing up in just these concrete landscapes. Right. And I really think we're depriving our young people of something if they don't grow up with this. I mean, I remember as a kid, we were in a kind of a suburb, but there were lots of woods. It wasn't all developed yet. And I remember finding owl pellets and sorting through and finding the little bones from mice. I remember finding snake skins and climbing trees and chasing butterflies and fireflies. And like, that is so good. There's something so wholesome about that.
Totally. And that just whole idea of paying attention, which is what so many societies did for so many generations, is they were just paying attention. They were noticing the land. They were in relationship, like you were saying. And I think in the capitalistic system that we live in, I have a few poems about this, and I write about how at some point as kids, like, you're sort of handed a checkbook, and it's like, it's time for you to be an adult now. It's time to learn how to write checks. It's time to talk about how you buy your first car. You become a little adult, and that also means it's time to give up those childish ways. We don't look at owl pellets anymore. We don't have curiosity anymore. We don't practice humility anymore. We need to buck up and become Americans. And I think that really can hurt and has hurt a lot of us. We kind of trade our childlikeness for that, and that doesn't happen to everyone. I know a lot of people who are just as incredibly childlike and love nature, and they always have. So it's not, but in our society, that often happens. And when you pair that then with oppression that happens in different communities because they don't have access to nature, to these things, it just compounds it. And I think we need to keep paying attention. I think we, in our communities, need to pay attention. We need to honor that relationship and notice how it has changed throughout the centuries.
Beautiful. Well, I don't think I can get out of here without asking you about the word resistance. It's the title of Kaitlin's most recent book. And today she talked a bit about, in her sermon at noon, resistance in some really surprising ways. You talked about intergenerational relationships as resistance. You talked about mindfulness as resistance. And that's not how I usually think of that word. So I'm wondering if we can kind of explore the importance of, and how do you conceive of resistance in this 2023 day and age we're in?
I like to take terms that have become popular and ask what they actually mean. Like, what's the definition of that word? And then ask if the packaging we have for it makes sense or if we can stretch it a little. And so that's what I did in my new book is, of course, I looked up the like scientific definition of what resistance is and then decided that wasn't super helpful. And then, and then thought about what are we resisting? What do I want to resist in my daily life? And I realized that for future generations, for the future of Mother Earth, for the future of our lives that we are living right now, I think that we have to learn to resist the toxic status quo, whatever that is. We have status quos all around us, whether we realize it or not. We have status quos of ableism. We have a status quo of white supremacy, of racism, of hate, of colonization. We have all of these different aspects of what this is. And so we can look at the American context or the worldwide context, but resistance is how do we use our everyday life? How do we use whatever privilege we have? How do we use our own stories to push against that status quo in solidarity with other people who are also doing it in their own beautiful way? And so I wanted it to be a book that honored resistance and care for ourselves. So there's the personal realm, like how do we do it in our own life through care and getting massages when you travel and taking care of yourself and doing the things you love and knowing your own story and telling the truth. How do we do it in communities? How do we practice solidarity and kinship? How do we do it in our relationship to the earth? How do we do it for our ancestors and for future generations? And so I wanted to frame this book and my work in a way that we stretch that idea of resistance, not just to mean like the raised fist of we're standing against something, but we're choosing something on the other side. And so what is this? What are we choosing? Like, what world do we want to create? If we're pushing against some sort of toxic status quo, we have to be choosing something else as well. And that's up to us. That's up to us and how we create that world and the stories that we get to tell. And so does that make sense?
I think it opens a door.
Yeah.
Because I don't know that there is one answer.
No.
It is, like you said, there are status quos all over the place, and I guess questioning what do I just take for granted, and maybe what needs to change. What about you, Jemar?
Heidi, you must be a reader. These questions are deep.
I heard you were coming.
This is good. When I think of resistance, I think of the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And it feels to me like resistance is the conflict that occurs when we are trying to pray and live out God's kingdom in a world that rejects it. And so it is this spiritual cosmic conflict until Jesus returns. And the current book project I'm doing now is tentatively titled The Spirit of Justice, Stories of Race, Faith, and Resistance. And really it's a book about how do we keep going when it feels like we're not winning? When that resistance to justice feels insurmountable. But one of the things I'm learning writing the book, which is a historical survey of how Christians understood their faith as resisting racism and white supremacy instead of being complicit with it, is there's all kinds of forms of resistance. Anything that sort of asserts your human dignity and your image of godness can be a form of resistance. So we were just writing about David Walker's Appeal, which is probably the best known abolitionist pamphlet of the era, written in 1829, and it's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And it's a black man writing to other black people, reminding them of their dignity, and that's resistance. And also reading about, on the slave ships, there were revolts to try to take over the slave ships, but there were also suicides. And it said, I'd rather die than be enslaved, because I know my worth, and I'm not going to be reduced, right? And poetry's resistance, and breaking a tool when you're supposed to be working for the plantation owner's resistance, and what it does is create this sort of capacious idea that anything that we try to do that leads to flourishing can be a form of resistance.
Can singing be resistance?
Yes.
I think, and I'm not going to ask you to sing. Just.
I was going to say, does it have to be good singing?
No.
But no.
You just mentioned flourishing, and I think about, how music can, get people's heart rates going at the same tempo, and how, or you hear an instrumentalist, and there's just vibrations going through your body.
I mean, we think of the powwow, the drum beat, like at a powwow, the beat of the drum is meant to remind us of our mother's heartbeat when we're in her womb. And so that's the beat of Mother Earth, and so the beat of the drum is meant to pull us back to the earth. It's meant to pull us back home to our bodies, to our ancestors. Like, it's so powerful, and it is resistance in every way.
My last question for you all, I promised we were going to turn toward the future for a little, just for the last question. Everybody on this panel is a parent with children still living at home. So how are you thinking about and working toward the spiritual formation of your children?
You're giving me a lot of credit to say I'm thinking that much about it. And
I talked to your wife, she told me.
I mean, my son is 12, and a lot of what we're doing is trying to really instill him with a positive self-image as a black boy who studies show that by the time black boys are around 12 years old, people view them as on average 3 years older, which is how you get a Tamir Rice being killed, right? So knowing full well he's going to lose that, kind of youthful cuteness, and then all of a sudden his embodied self becomes a threat to so many, right? So there's a spiritual dimension to understanding oneself through God's eyes first, and through the eyes of the people who love you first, and not a world that has categorized and stereotyped and put you in a box. So that's a big part of what we're doing. The other part is just, in terms of God as a parent, understanding God as a parent, as a father, whatever, trying my best to show him what a loving parent does, while also holding the fact that I'm very imperfect, and not to blame that on God. You know what I mean? So, we're doing that at the same time that we're trying to heal from our own church hurt. Like, it's not, we've been in communities that I've led my family into that haven't been safe. So it's a lot going on that reminds us that it's going to be by the grace of God that we get through this thing.
Yeah. I have 2 kids, 2 boys, they're 9 and 11. And so, again, like, similarly raising 2 Potawatomi kids, and, every year being ready to fight against what they're learning in school about history, about indigenous history, about so much of history, trying to instill in them who they are, and also a love for all cultures, all faiths, all religions. That's really important to us as a family. When my kids were young, my husband sort of gave them like these little mottos that he had just gifted them. I don't know why, I don't know when it happened, but to one of them it was find things that are wrong and make them right. And to the other it was make the world more beautiful. And I will say that those are interchangeable between both of my kids, but it kind of speaks to like the fierceness of truth telling and also the gentle beauty of it, and how that all can be true in our lives for ourselves. And I think that we're trying to instill that in our kids every day, and again trying to live it in a very imperfect way, but being honest about who we are as humans and parents is a huge part of that.
We have just a couple of minutes here. If you listened to our conversation this evening and you have something that you would like to ask, a question for our panelists, we invite you to do that.
Y'all mentioned DEI and checking boxes. Do y'all have, I know in Jemar's book, The Color of Compromise, in the back, there was a few activities, but can y'all list or say some specific things that individuals or churches or groups within churches could do to do more than check the box?
So my second book, How to Fight Racism, is all about that, and it expands on the last chapter in The Color of Compromise. These days, I'm thinking less in terms of isolated tasks and more in terms of the framework I lay out in the book, which is called the Arc of Racial Justice, and that's an acronym that stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. And you can sort of do a self-audit, and awareness is all of the information, all the knowledge, all the data that we need to understand in particular racial dynamics. So that's reading the books, watching the documentaries, listening to a podcast, right? Did a lot of that in 2020 and not much else. But relationships is how do we break out of our silos? That looks different for different people groups. For white folks, y'all have become experts on separating yourselves from anyone you didn't want to be around. And so you're going to have to exert extra effort to put yourself in the way of people who are different. For people of color, that means solidarity. I was talking to Kaitlin just before we press record. I'm like, this is it, right? We got indigenous, we got black up here. Like, they're going to get real scared real soon. So, it's coming together in ways that we can resist more effectively. And then commitment isn't just staying the course. It means how do we commit to the actual systemic and policy changes that affect more than just individuals, but the way we sort of do life together as a whole. So that's lobbying and voting and things of that nature. So to me, the exact what to do is very contextual.
Yeah.
It's going to be different in Memphis than it is in Louisville or Philadelphia or wherever. And oftentimes, people have a sense of what to do. I find the real issue is not what to do, but are we willing to do it? So to me, the real hurdle is actually exercising faith, knowing that if we resist, the outcome is not guaranteed and our comfort is not guaranteed, but that is the way of Jesus.
That sounds a lot like faith.
Sounds a lot like faith. Now, I do give practical suggestions in the book, which is right over there on the table.
Available for purchase from our friends at Novel. We have time for another question, if there is one.
Dr. Tisby, I wish you would comment on being a young TFA student coming out of Chicago, moving into the metropolitan area of Helena, Arkansas, and the educational experience of leading a classroom there. And I guess the last question would be, where is Helena, Arkansas, the Mississippi Delta, the Arkansas Delta going to be in 10 years?
Oh my! So you got a connection to the
I
area.
didn't get this accent in Chicago.
I got mine there. Wow, it was a culture shock. One of the layers of it is, from my perspective, my students didn't have a category for me as a young, black, educated, not from the Delta male in education. They didn't know whether to love me or hate me, or like they just didn't have a category for me. So for me, it took a long time just to be fully myself in that environment. It's absolutely heartbreaking in terms of poverty. So the poverty level in Arkansas is slightly higher than the national average, and the poverty level in my town was over twice that. 43% of people live at or below the poverty line. And that affects our education, for sure. So generation after generation just underinvested, and to see these brilliant young minds deprived of resources, and there's literal white flight school in the town. It was started in 1971 when the federal government starts to enforce desegregation, and all of a sudden it's like, you know what, we need a new private school that the white community self-funded, and all of those resources going into this private school instead of the public schools. But at the same time, it really transformed my concepts of wealth, because there's a richness in the Delta that can't be quantified, particularly in the relationships. The way people love and care for one another, it's hard to be isolated in such a small community, but with an understanding of we don't have much going for us materially, but we have each other, was a lesson that I hope to carry with me and enact. And in 10 years, economically it don't look good. It doesn't appear to be getting better. The county has been losing population since the 1970s. It continues that trend. More stuff shutting down than opening up. And I think there will be a remnant of materially destitute people who we will generally overlook because not only are they poor, not only are they black, but they're rural. So it's not, in my view, a very bright picture.
What's the high school population as far as racial construction? Private.
Yeah.
You know, they call those academies.
That's right.
In Mississippi, I think it was so hysterical even when they started up, and like in the 70s, at the white flag, they all called them academies.
Right, yep. Yeah, it's called an academy in our town. All the public schools are 98% black. To the extent there is diversity, it's the poor whites, you know, who can't go to the academy. And then the reverse for the academy, of course.
The academies now, they recruit black athletes.
Oh yeah. They love to see us run, jump, kick, yeah. Great question.
All right. I want to give Kaitlin just one last question about, you used the word solidarity tonight, and I want you, wonder if you would unpack that word just, I know I took the microphone back for the last question, but what do you envision as a solidarity that we're aiming toward?
Again, I like definitions, so in the book I also play out the definition of solidarity, but basically we need to be asking, solidarity is this idea of like the root, like what is the root cause, what is the root goal, what is the thing, you know, like in the church, is our solidarity in Jesus, you know, in our interfaith conversations, what's our solidarity rooted in? And so when we think of it that way, why are we fighting for the things we're fighting for? Why are we coming together? And I write about how solidarity, and you've already mentioned this, I mean, we've talked about this, that solidarity comes at a cost. It will cost something to stand with people that people don't want to stand with. It will cost something to think about indigenous communities and the land. I mean, it's not meant to be something that comes easy, and it doesn't. And also, I think it can, the allyship conversation of people who want to be in solidarity and do the work, but it often can feel tokenizing, I think, to be the indigenous friend, or and so I think there's a lot of work to be done in how we practice real solidarity, and that do we really want to be in this together? Like, do we really want to fight against these systems that have been in place for so long? Do we really want to understand what colonialism is and what white supremacy is, and all of these, again, the forms of status quo that we have created, that have been created, that have held and still continue to be created and recreated all the time? Are we really willing to step into this together? And I think that that's the question that we all have to ask individually. I mean, it has to be a really deep question, and a question that may not have a totally solid answer, and a question that will take our whole lives to answer.
Yes,
because that's the other problem, is we want quick fixes. That's the American way, and it's not good when we do that. It just leads to burnout and pain for a lot of people that are trying change things. And so we have to remember that solidarity is a lifelong movement and embodiment.
I think that's a beautiful place to stop. Stepping into a vision that is not quite settled, but together. Thank you so much, Jemar Tisby and Kaitlin Curtice, for being with us tonight. You can catch Jemar here at noon tomorrow and check out the recording of Kaitlin's sermon at calvarymemphis.org. And as you're on your way out, do check out the book table from our friends at Novel. Buy everything that they have. This is their last night, and they don't want to pack any of it up. So buy it all. You can have Kaitlin and Jemar sign it, and thank you. Good night.
Thank you all.